You want me to sell my home to pay off debts for a brother who hasn't spoken to me in 12 years? My mother just stared, coldly demanding I sacrifice my only sanctuary for her golden boy once again. Have you ever felt completely invisible to the people who are supposed to love you the most?
Share your own stories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to hear how I finally stood my ground. But long before she tried to take my future, she abandoned me in the past. It all started with a quiet, painful realization. I learned early on that love in our household was a finite resource, and my brother Leo held the absolute monopoly. I was 7 and Leo was 9, but the gap between us might as well have been a massive chasm. My mother, Evelyn, didn't just love Leo, she worshipped his potential. He was the gifted one, the boy who could solve complex math puzzles and play the violin by ear. I, on the other hand, was just ordinary. I liked drawing in the dirt and collecting interesting pebbles from the driveway. Every morning began exactly the same way. The smell of pancakes filled the kitchen, but the first and largest stack always went to Leo. Brain food, Mom would say, her eyes gleaming with pride as she watched him eat. I would quietly pour my own cereal, careful not to spill milk on the linoleum floor, because I knew no one would help me clean it up. I didn't hate Leo. It was hard to hate someone who barely noticed you existed. But the ache in my chest grew heavier with every forgotten birthday and every overlooked drawing I brought home from school. I tried so hard to earn a fraction of the warmth Mom showered on him. I kept my room spotless, did my homework without being asked, and even tried to learn the piano. But my fingers were clumsy, and my mother's patience was completely non-existent. "Don't force it, Maya," she sighed one afternoon, gently pushing me away from the keys so Leo could practice.
Not everyone is meant to be extraordinary. Those words planted a seed of an inadequacy deep in my heart. I was the shadow cast by his blinding light, an afterthought in my own home, waiting for a turn that would never come.
The disparity between us became undeniably clear the winter I turned 10. The heating in our small suburban house was notoriously unreliable, and the bitter chill seeped directly into the floorboards. My winter boots from the previous year had worn completely through the soles. I spent weeks stuffing old newspapers into the toes, pretending the dampness was just a minor inconvenience. I finally mustered the courage to ask my mother for a new pair. I found her at the kitchen table, meticulously balancing a checkbook. When I showed her the gaping hole in my left shoe, she barely glanced up. "Maya, please," she muttered, rubbing her temples. "Money is incredibly tight right now. Leo's advanced violin masterclass is next month, and the tuition is due. You'll just have to make those work." I stared at her, the cold newspaper in my shoe suddenly feeling like a block of ice against my bare skin. "But my feet are freezing, Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Don't be dramatic," she snapped, finally looking at me, but her eyes held only annoyance. "Sacrifices have to be made for the greater good of this family. Leo is going to be someone important. You need to understand that." That evening, I watched from the hallway as Leo unwrapped a brand new velvet-lined case for his violin bow. The cost of that case alone could have bought me 10 pairs of winter boots. He didn't even look thrilled. He just nodded, expecting nothing less. I retreated to my room, wrapping my feet in 2 pairs of socks, and cried silently into my pillow. It wasn't just about the boots. It was the crushing realization that my basic needs would always be secondary to his luxuries. The day my mother left felt deceptively normal. It was a crisp Tuesday in late autumn. I was 13, old enough to sense the shifting currents in our house, but naive enough to hope they wouldn't pull me under. Mom had been packing boxes for a week, explaining that we were decluttering. I should have known better. The only things going into those boxes belonged exclusively to her and Leo. When I returned from school, the house was eerily silent. The lingering scent of her lavender perfume was the only proof she had been there at all. In the center of the kitchen table sat a plain white envelope with my name scrawled hastily across it. My hands shook as I tore it open. Maya, the letter read, Leo has been accepted into a prestigious conservatory in the city. This is the opportunity of a lifetime, and I have to support him. I can't afford to take you both, and the city is no place for a girl without a clear direction. The rent here is paid for the next month. I've spoken to the school counselor. You're resourceful. You'll figure it out. I'll send money when I can. I read the words 3 times before the reality crashed down on me. She wasn't just moving. She was abandoning me. I was a 13-year-old girl, discarded like an old piece of furniture that didn't fit into the new, glamorous life she envisioned for her golden boy. I sank to the kitchen floor, clutching the letter to my chest. No tears came at first, just a hollow, suffocating numbness. I was completely alone in an empty house, traded away for a violin in a dream that wasn't mine. The first week of living alone was a blur of survival and deep denial. I rationed the pantry staples, mostly dry pasta and canned soup, and kept the curtains drawn, terrified that if anyone found out my mother had left, the authorities would take me away. I couldn't bear the thought of a foster home. The silence of the house was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and the erratic thumping of my anxious heart. On the 8th day, a loud, persistent knock echoed through the hallway. I froze, holding my breath. The knocking didn't stop. I know you're in there, Maya. Open this door before I knock it off its hinges, a gruff voice called out. I peeked through the peephole to see Mrs. Higgins, our eccentric, reclusive neighbor. She lived at the end of the street in a sprawling, wildly overgrown estate that the neighborhood kids swore was haunted. I cracked the door open just an inch. Your mother is a fool, Mrs. Higgins stated bluntly, pushing the door open and stepping inside without an invitation. She was a tall woman in her late 60s, wearing dirt-stained gardening overalls and an expression of fierce determination. I saw her pack up that boy and leave. Figured I'd give her a week to come to her senses. Clearly she hasn't. I'm fine, I lied, my voice cracking under the pressure. Mrs. Higgins scoffed, looking at my pale face and the empty soup cans on the kitchen counter. You're a child and you're starving. Pack your things, girl. You're not staying in this miserable, hollow house for another minute. For the first time since my mother left, I felt a glimmer of safety. I didn't argue. I just started packing. Moving into Mrs. Higgins's estate was like stepping into another world entirely. The house was a massive, rambling Victorian structure, its paint peeling and its roof sagging in certain places. The yard was a jungle of untamed roses, ancient oak trees, and creeping ivy. Inside, the air smelled uniquely of old books, dried herbs, and beeswax. It was chaotic, cluttered, and completely wonderful. I don't do coddling, Mrs. Higgins announced, as she showed me to a spacious, sunlit bedroom on the 2nd floor. You'll pull your weight around here. You'll help with the garden, you'll learn to cook something other than canned soup, and you'll keep your grades up. In return, you get a roof, warm food, and someone who actually sees you. I nodded eagerly, my heart swelling with a strange, unfamiliar warmth. She wasn't my mother, and she didn't pretend to be. But she offered me solid structure, expectations, and a place where I mattered. Over the next few months, Clara, she insisted I call her by her first name, taught me how to prune roses properly, how to bake bread from scratch, and how to fix a leaky faucet. For the first time in my life, my hands were celebrated, not for playing a delicate musical instrument, but for being capable and strong. Clara didn't care about giftedness. She cared about resilience. As the seasons changed, the memory of my mother's cold dismissal began to fade slightly, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of life at the estate. I wasn't the invisible sister anymore. I was Maya, the girl who could bring a dying rosebush back to life. I had finally found a true home, not with blood, but with a stranger who recognized my worth. The years slipped by, transforming me from a discarded 13-year-old into a capable young woman. Under Clara's firm but loving guidance, I flourished. I graduated high school with honors, an achievement celebrated with a homemade roast dinner and a rare, genuine smile from Clara. My biological mother, however, marked the occasion by not marking it at all. Instead, my only connection to Evelyn and Leo came in the form of sporadic, glossy postcards. They arrived once or twice a year, postmarked from cities like Vienna, Paris, or New York. The messages on the back were never truly addressed to me. They were press releases for my brother's life. Maya, Leo's solo at the conservatory was breathtaking. The critics are calling him a generational talent.
Hope you're staying out of trouble, Mom. There was never a return address, no phone number, and certainly no inquiries about my well-being. She didn't know I had joined the debate team or that I had discovered a passion for landscape architecture. She didn't know I was living down the street from our old empty house.
Every postcard was a tiny paper cut to my heart, a reminder that I was merely a distant acquaintance in her grand narrative of Leo's success. I used to save them in a shoebox under my bed, hoping that one day the narrative would shift. But on my 18th birthday, when a postcard arrived detailing Leo's new luxury apartment, instead of wishing me well, I finally took the box to the backyard fire pit and watched the glossy paper turn to ash. I realized then that I couldn't keep breaking my own heart over a mother who had chosen to forget me.
By the time I turned 22, the dynamic at the estate had slowly inverted. Clara, who had always seemed as immovable and sturdy as the ancient oak trees in our front yard, began to falter. A quiet, persistent illness settled into her bones, stealing her energy and confining her to the first-floor parlor. It was my turn to be the caretaker.
I took over the maintenance of the sprawling house and the massive gardens, turning my passion for plants into a small but thriving nursery business right on the property. I cooked the meals, managed the finances, and sat with Clara for hours, reading aloud or simply holding her fragile, paper-thin hand.
"You work too hard, Maya," she rasped one evening, watching me wipe down the antique sideboards. "You should be out with friends, traveling, living." I paused, tossing the rag over my shoulder, and knelt beside her armchair. "This is my life, Clara. You gave me a home when I was literally starving. You gave me a future. Taking care of you isn't a burden. It's my absolute privilege."
She looked at me, her sharp blue eyes softening with an unspeakable depth of emotion. She reached out, her trembling fingers gently brushing a stray curl from my forehead. It was the most maternal gesture I had ever received. In that quiet room, filled with the scent of dried eucalyptus and old memories, I understood the true definition of family.
It wasn't about shared DNA or projected ambitions. It was about who stayed when things got difficult and who held your hand in the dark. Clara was my mother in every way that truly mattered, and my heart shattered knowing our time together was slipping away.
Clara passed away quietly in her sleep on a rainy Tuesday in April. The grief was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in my chest that left me breathless. I buried her on a quiet hill overlooking the town, surrounded by the wild roses she had taught me to cultivate. A week later, I sat in the stuffy, wood-paneled office of Mr. Abernathy, Clara's longtime attorney. I expected to be told I had a few weeks to pack my things and vacate the estate. Instead, Mr. Abernathy slid a thick, bound folder across his mahogany desk. "Mrs. Higgins was a very pragmatic woman," he began, adjusting his spectacles. "She knew exactly what she wanted, and she anticipated complications. She left the entirety of the estate, the house, the land, and her modest savings to you, Maya." I gasped, tears instantly springing to my eyes. "All of it?
"But I'm not family." She disagreed. Mr. Abernathy smiled gently. "However, Clara was also highly aware of your biological family's history.
She feared that if your mother ever discovered you had inherited a valuable piece of property, she might try to exploit the situation. Therefore, Clara structured the inheritance through a highly specific, airtight legal deed.
The property is in your name, but it is shielded by clauses that make it impossible for anyone claiming blood relation to contest it or force a sale without your explicit, legally uncoerced consent." I touched the heavy paper of the deed, a profound sense of awe washing over me. Even from beyond the grave, Clara was protecting me.
She had handed me the keys to my kingdom and built an impenetrable fortress around it. I was secure, independent, and finally safe.
Over the next 3 years, the Higgins estate transformed. I poured every ounce of my grief and love into the soil, expanding my nursery into a prominent botanical garden and event space. Maya's Sanctuary, the locals called it. The rundown Victorian mansion was meticulously restored, its peeling paint replaced with fresh, vibrant colors. I was 25, financially independent, and deeply rooted in my community. While my life was blossoming, rumors began to drift into town regarding the Golden Boy. A former classmate who worked in the city happened to visit my nursery and brought gossip that made my stomach churn. Leo, it seemed, was not the generational talent my mother had relentlessly advertised.
The transition from childhood prodigy to adult professional had broken him. The relentless pressure, combined with my mother's extravagant spending to maintain their high society image, had caught up with them. He had been dropped from the conservatory for severe burnout, and a series of disastrous financial investments had left them swimming in overwhelming debt.
I stood in my greenhouse, watering the orchids, trying to process the information. A part of me felt a twinge of pity for Leo. He had never been allowed to be a child, only an investment. But when I thought of my mother, my jaw clenched. She had sacrificed my childhood, my basic needs, and my heart to fund a gamble that had ultimately failed. I told myself it didn't matter.
They were in the city, miles away from my peaceful existence. Their financial ruin was not my burden to bear. I was entirely wrong.
The storm arrived without warning. It was a humid, late summer afternoon, and I was in the parlor, finalizing a contract for a large autumn wedding to be hosted in the gardens. Heavy rain lashed against the tall Victorian windows. Suddenly, the loud, desperate chime of the front doorbell shattered the quiet. I frowned, setting my pen down. I wasn't expecting any clients in this weather. I walked into the grand foyer, pulling the heavy oak door open. Standing on my porch, soaked to the bone and shivering, was a woman I hardly recognized. Her designer coat was stained and frayed, her posture hunched, and the arrogant sparkle in her eyes had been replaced by a hollow desperation. It was Evelyn, my mother. "Maya," she breathed, her voice trembling as she looked up at me. She glanced past my shoulder, taking in the gleaming hardwood floors and the expensive antique chandelier of the restored foyer. Her eyes widened in clear calculation. I stood frozen, my hand gripping the brass doorknob so tightly my knuckles turned white. 12 years. 12 years of absolute silence, of birthdays spent alone, of surviving on Clara's charity. And now she was standing on my porch as if she had just stepped out to buy milk. "Mom." The word felt foreign, like ash on my tongue. "Oh, my sweet girl," she sobbed, taking a step forward and attempting to pull me into a hug. "I've missed you so incredibly much. Please, you have to help us. Leo and I, we have nowhere else to go." I took a rigid step back, refusing the embrace. The cold reality of the situation settled over me like a heavy winter blanket. She hadn't come back for her daughter. She had come back for a lifeline.
I couldn't leave them out in the freezing rain, no matter how much my heart screamed to slam the heavy oak door. I stepped aside, and Evelyn scurried into the foyer, dripping water onto the pristine rugs.
Behind her, a shadowed figure shuffled onto the porch. It was Leo. My breath caught in my throat.
The boy who used to stand so tall, practically glowing with our mother's relentless praise, was entirely gone. He looked profoundly exhausted, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a damp, oversized trench coat. He didn't look at me. His eyes remained fixed firmly on the floorboards, carrying an unbearable shroud of shame.
There was no violin case in his hand, just a cheap, waterlogged duffel bag. "Get out of those wet things," I managed to say, my voice clipped and strictly professional, the same tone I used with difficult vendors at the nursery. "I'll bring you some towels." I retreated to the kitchen, my hands trembling as I pulled fresh linens from the pantry.
My mind was a chaotic whirlwind of unresolved anger and jarring disbelief. They were actually here. The people who had casually erased me from their lives had reappeared precisely when their own had collapsed. When I returned to the parlor, Evelyn was already pacing the length of the room, her eyes darting greedily over the restored crown molding, the velvet armchairs, and the expensive porcelain vases Clara had collected. She wasn't acting like a destitute mother seeking refuge. She was acting like an appraiser evaluating a prize. Leo just sat rigidly on the edge of the sofa, looking like a ghost haunting a life he didn't belong in. The unwanted reunion had officially begun, and the air was thick with unspoken demands.
I handed them the towels and set a tray of hot tea on the mahogany coffee table. Evelyn took a sip, her eyes never stopping their rapid assessment of my home. "This place is remarkable, Maya," she said, her tone laced with a forced, syrupy sweetness that made my skin crawl. "I always knew Mrs. Higgins had a large house, but I had no idea it was this extravagant."
How in the world are you affording the rent on a caretaker's salary? I sat in the armchair opposite them, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I don't pay rent, Mom, and I'm not the caretaker. I own the estate. Evelyn's teacup rattled violently against its saucer. She stared at me, her mouth slightly agape, trying to compute the information. "You own it?"
"She left this entire property to you?" "Yes," I replied calmly. A terrifying shift occurred in my mother's eyes. The desperate, pleading woman on the porch vanished, replaced instantly by the calculating manager who had once traded my winter boots for a velvet violin case. A slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. "Oh, Maya," she breathed, leaning forward. "This is an absolute miracle."
"It's fate. We lost everything in the city, sweetheart. Leo's investors pulled out. The conservatory abandoned him, and the banks took the apartment. We are drowning in debt." She gestured broadly around the luxurious parlor. "But this is our salvation. The equity in a property like this must be astronomical." I stared at her, the sheer audacity of her words echoing in the quiet room.
She hadn't asked how I was. She hadn't asked about the years of silence. She had simply looked at my sanctuary and immediately designated it as her rescue boat.
"What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. Evelyn laughed, a light, dismissive sound, as if the answer were the most obvious thing in the world. "I'm saying we are saved. You can take out a mortgage on the estate, or better yet, we can sell it outright."
With the market right now, the money will be more than enough to clear Leo's debts and set him up with a brand new studio. He just needs a fresh start, Maya, a proper comeback. I looked at Leo. He visibly flinched at her words, burying his face in his hands, but he remained entirely silent. He was still letting her fight his battles, still riding the wave of her destructive ambition.
"Sell it," I repeated, the words tasting like poison. "You want me to sell my home, my business, and the only sanctuary I've ever known to pay off debts for a brother who hasn't spoken to me in 12 years? Don't be selfish, Maya." Evelyn's voice spiked with sudden irritation, her syrupy facade cracking. "We are family. Family helps each other in times of crisis." I am your mother, and I am telling you that your brother needs this. You owe it to us to step up. I owe you? I stood up, the years of suppressed agony finally bubbling to the surface. You left me alone in an empty, freezing house when I was 13. You left a child with a single month's rent and a note on the kitchen table. Clara Higgins took me in. Clara fed me. Clara raised me. This house was her legacy, and she entrusted it to me. It is absolutely not yours to sell.
The parlor fell into a stunned silence. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked methodically, marking the heaviest seconds of my life. You were always so incredibly dramatic, Evelyn finally scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. I left you in a safe neighborhood. I knew you were resourceful. And look at you. If I hadn't left, you wouldn't have met that crazy old woman, and you wouldn't be sitting in this mansion today. If anything, you should be thanking me. The sheer delusion of her statement hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't just avoiding accountability, she was actively trying to take credit for the life I had painstakingly built from the rebel she left behind. Thanking you? I whispered, tears of absolute frustration stinging my eyes. I wore newspapers in my shoes so Leo could have a velvet case. I ate canned soup in the dark, terrified that social services would take me away. You didn't give me an opportunity. You threw me away because I wasn't gifted enough to fund your ego. Stop it, Mom, a hoarse, broken voice interrupted. Evelyn and I both turned. Leo had finally lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a profound sorrow. "She's right," he said softly. "We have no right to be here. We have no right to ask her for anything. Let's just go." "Quiet, Leo," Evelyn snapped, whirling on him with terrifying ferocity. "I have sacrificed my entire life for your career. I am not walking away from our only lifeline because your sister wants to hold a petty grudge. We are staying and we are fixing this." She turned back to me, her eyes hardened into twin stones of pure ice. Evelyn stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her damp designer coat with deliberate, aggressive motions. The air between us was entirely toxic. "Listen to me very carefully, Maya," she said, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I am your biological mother. I gave you life. Legally, you were my dependent when that old bat gave you this property. There are laws about these things. Family estates, filial responsibility, next of kin rights? You think you can just hoard this wealth while your own flesh and blood sleeps on the street?" "You abandoned your rights to me the day you walked out that door," I replied, standing my ground, though my heart was hammering wildly against my ribs. "We'll see what a judge has to say about that," Evelyn sneered, pulling her purse over her shoulder. "I know lawyers in the city, good ones. I'll tell them how a manipulative old woman coerced a minor into an isolated life, hoarding assets that rightfully belong to her family. I will drag you through probate court until the legal fees force you to sell this place anyway. You can do this the easy way and help your brother, or I will take this entire estate from you." She marched toward the front door, pausing only to bark an order at Leo. "Come along. We'll find a motel. I have phone calls to make." Leo stood up slowly. He looked at me, a silent, agonizing apology in his eyes, before shuffling out after her into the fading storm. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving me standing alone in the grand foyer. My hands were shaking, but as I looked up at the sturdy, beautifully restored walls of Clara's home, a fierce, unbreakable resolve ignited in my chest. She wanted a war. She had no idea how well Clara had armed me. The very next morning, I was sitting across from Mr. Abernathy in his familiar wood-paneled office. The rain from the previous day had given way to a dismal gray drizzle, perfectly matching my internal anxiety. I recounted Evelyn's threats word for word, my hands tightly clutching a warm mug of tea.
Miss
Abernathy listened in absolute silence, his expression unreadable behind his wire-rimmed spectacles. When I finished, he let out a long, heavy sigh and leaned back in his leather chair. "She is entirely desperate, Maya," he stated calmly, folding his hands over his desk. "And desperate people often make incredibly foolish decisions."
She is banking on the fact that you are young and easily intimidated. She wants you to settle out of fear before this ever reaches a courtroom. Can she actually take it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She said things about filial responsibility and minor coercion. She made it sound like she had a legitimate claim. Mr. Abernathy offered a rare, reassuring smile.
Clara anticipated this exact scenario. She knew your mother was ruthless when it came to funding your brother's ambitions. The deed we drafted isn't just a standard transfer of property. It contains specific, unassailable clauses detailing your mother's abandonment, accompanied by sworn affidavits from neighbors and your old school counselor. He tapped the thick file resting on his desk.
If Evelyn wants to take this before a judge, she is walking blindly into a trap of her own making. We will not settle, Maya. We will let her present her fabricated case, and then we will completely dismantle it.
2 days before the preliminary hearing, I found Leo sitting alone on a rusted bench near the edge of my botanical garden. He looked completely out of place among the vibrant blooming hydrangeas, his posture defeated and his clothes slightly rumpled. I approached him cautiously. "If you're here to convince me to drop the deed, you're wasting your time."
He flinched, staring down at his bruised, calloused hands. "I'm not here for the house, Maya. I came to apologize." I crossed my arms, guarding my heart. "An apology is a little late, don't you think?" "I know," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I never asked her to leave you, but I never stopped her either. I was so terrified of disappointing her, of losing that pedestal she put me on. She made me feel like if I didn't play perfectly, I was worthless." Tears welled in his eyes as he finally looked at me. "The conservatory didn't just drop me. I quit. I couldn't breathe anymore. I haven't touched a violin in 2 years. When the money ran out, she became obsessed with fixing me, fixing the brand. She's not fighting for my future, Maya. She's fighting for her own failed investment." The anger that had been simmering inside me softened into a profound, heavy sadness. Leo wasn't the villain. He was just another victim of Evelyn's conditional love. He had been a prisoner in a golden cage, while I had been left to roam free. "I can't give her the house, Leo," I said gently. "I don't want you to," he replied, standing up. "Keep your sanctuary, Maya. It's the only real thing either of us has ever had." The official court summons arrived via registered mail. Reading the official complaint was like reading a poorly written fiction novel. Evelyn's high-priced city lawyer had drafted a narrative that painted my mother as a grieving, desperate woman who had been forcefully separated from her daughter by a manipulative, mentally unstable elderly neighbor. The document claimed that Clara Higgins had exploited my youth and emotional vulnerability, grooming me to act as her unpaid servant in exchange for a fraudulent inheritance. It boldly demanded the immediate nullification of the deed and the liquidation of the estate's assets to be redistributed to my mother, my rightful legal guardian. I read the pages at my kitchen table, the sheer arrogance of the lies making my blood boil. There was no mention of the empty pantry, the winter boots with holes, or the single month's rent left on the counter. It was a complete erasure of my trauma, repackaged into a convenient sob story for a judge. It's infuriating, isn't it, mister? Abernathy noted when I called him, my voice shaking with indignation. "It's a complete fabrication," I replied angrily. "How can they legally submit this?" "Paper will accept whatever ink you spill on it, Maya," he said sagely, "but a courtroom requires proof. Let them build their house of cards. The higher they build it, the harder it will inevitably fall. Stay calm and trust the process." I took a deep breath, looking around the warm, sunlit kitchen that Clara and I had painted together. This wasn't just about protecting a piece of real estate anymore. It was about protecting Clara's memory from being dragged through the mud by a woman who knew absolutely nothing about love. The municipal courthouse was a sterile, intimidating building that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. I sat beside Mr. Abernathy at the defense table, wearing a conservative navy suit, my hands folded tightly in my lap to hide their trembling. Across the aisle, Evelyn looked like she was attending a gala. She wore a sharp, tailored blazer, her hair perfectly coiffed, and a pair of expensive pearls resting at her throat. She carried an air of absolute, unshakable confidence. Leo sat behind her in the gallery, staring blankly at the mahogany paneling, looking entirely hollowed out. Judge Harrison, an older man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, took the bench. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the room before nodding to Evelyn's attorney. "Let us begin. Counsel, you are moving to invalidate a registered property deed based on undue influence and minor coercion?" Evelyn's lawyer, a slick man in a pinstripe suit, stood up dramatically. "Yes, Your Honor."
We intend to prove that the deceased Clara Higgins preyed upon a vulnerable, momentarily separated family, isolating my client's daughter to secure a caretaker. My client is simply seeking to rectify this tragic manipulation and reclaim her family's rightful assets during a time of severe financial hardship. Evelyn dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch to absolute perfection. It took every ounce of my willpower not to stand up and scream. I looked at Mr. Abernathy, who simply sat perfectly still, a microscopic, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The performance had begun. For an hour, Evelyn's lawyer painted a masterpiece of fiction. He spoke of motherly devotion, temporary misunderstandings, and the predatory nature of lonely old women. When he finally rested his case, looking immensely pleased with himself, Judge Harrison turned his gaze to our table. "Mr. Abernathy, do you have a response to these very colorful allegations?" Mr. Abernathy stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. "I do, Your Honor. In fact, I have a very brief response." He walked to the clerk and handed over a thick, bound document. Defense Exhibit A, the original deed of trust, drafted by myself and signed by Clara Higgins. Evelyn's lawyer scoffed audibly. "Your Honor, we have already established our challenge to that fraudulent document."
"I highly doubt you have challenged this specific document, Counselor," Mr. Abernathy replied coolly, "because if you had actually read it, you would know it contains the abandonment clause." The judge opened the file. "Explain, Mr. Abernathy." "Mrs. Higgins anticipated this exact greedy maneuver," my lawyer stated, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom.
"The deed requires that any biological family member attempting to contest the inheritance must first reimburse the estate for 12 years of back-owed child support, living expenses, educational costs, and emotional damages, calculated with interest. Furthermore, the deed includes sworn affidavits from Child Protective Services, whom Mrs. Higgins contacted the day Evelyn abandoned her 13-year-old daughter to chase her son's fame." Judge Harrison read the page, his eyebrows rising higher and higher. He looked down at Evelyn, who had turned the color of chalk. The judge let out a sharp, genuine bark of laughter. It echoed loudly in the quiet room. "Well," the judge chuckled, shaking his head, "Miss is certainly ironclad." The judge's laughter was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. He adjusted his glasses, looking down at my mother with a mixture of amusement and utter disdain. "Mrs. Evans," Judge Harrison began, his tone dripping with judicial irony, "according to this sworn and notarized addendum, before you can even petition to challenge this deed, you are required to pay the estate exactly $482,000. This covers 12 years of back child support, basic living expenses, inflation, and a very creatively calculated emotional negligence fee. Evelyn stood up abruptly, her jaw practically hitting the floor. That is utterly ridiculous. That's blatant extortion. She is my daughter.
A daughter you legally abandoned, according to the official Child Protective Services file attached to this document, the judge countered sharply, all traces of humor vanishing from his face. Mrs. Higgins made sure your abandonment was thoroughly documented.
You cannot walk away from a child, contribute absolutely nothing to her survival, and then return a decade later to claim the fruits of her labor. Evelyn's lawyer hurriedly began packing his briefcase, clearly realizing he had been marched into a complete slaughterhouse. Your Honor, we formally withdraw the petition, he muttered, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room.
Smart man, Judge Harrison nodded approvingly. Case dismissed with prejudice. Mrs. Evans, I strongly suggest you do not waste this court's time ever again. If I see you in my courtroom trying to harass this young woman, I will hold you in contempt. The wooden gavel slammed down with a resounding crack.
It wasn't just the end of the preliminary hearing. It was the definitive end of my mother's power over me. The heavy, suffocating chain she had wrapped around my heart 12 years ago shattered into a million irreversible pieces. The hallway outside the courtroom was brightly lit and deathly quiet. I walked out beside Mr. Abernathy, feeling a lightness in my chest I hadn't experienced since I was a small child. Evelyn burst through the heavy wooden doors a moment later, her face flushed with raw humiliation and simmering rage. You planned this, she hissed, marching directly toward me. You and that crazy old woman. You set a trap to completely humiliate me. I turned to face her, entirely unafraid. The terrified 13-year-old girl was gone. In her place stood a woman built from Clara's resilience and my own hard-earned strength. Clara protected me, I said evenly, looking her straight in the eye. Something a mother is supposed to do. You humiliated yourself, Evelyn. You walked in there expecting to steal my home because you still view me as completely expendable. We are ruined, Maya, she cried out, her voice cracking as her perfect posture finally slumped. Do you understand that? I have nothing left. You had 2 children, I replied quietly, the profound sadness of the truth settling heavily between us. You had a family. But you traded us for an illusion of grandeur. You ruined yourself. She reached out, perhaps to grab my arm or plead one last time, but I took a firm step back. The invisible boundary between us was now a fortified wall. She looked at my hardened expression and finally realized that no amount of guilt-tripping or manipulation would ever work again. The well of my forgiveness had completely run dry. I didn't hate her anymore, but I was absolutely done letting her destroy me. I turned my back on my mother and began to walk down the long, polished corridor toward the exit. Maya, wait! I stopped, turning to see Leo standing near the courtroom doors. He hadn't followed Evelyn. He stood awkwardly, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn trench coat. Evelyn turned to him, her eyes wide with frantic urgency. Come on, Leo, she commanded, snapping her fingers as if he were a disobedient pet. We are leaving right now. I'll call your Uncle Richard. He can loan us some money until I figure out a new strategy. Leo didn't move. He looked at Evelyn, and for the first time in his entire life, the absolute obedience in his eyes was gone. No, Mom, he said softly, but the words carried an undeniable, staggering weight. Excuse me? Evelyn gasped, genuinely shocked by his defiance. I said no, Leo repeated, his voice growing significantly steadier. I'm done. I'm not playing the violin again. I'm not attending any more networking parties, and I am not letting you manage my life anymore. I am completely broken, and you only care about the brand. I sacrificed everything for you, she shrieked, her polished facade entirely crumbling in the public hallway. And you destroyed my sister in the process, Leo yelled back, tears finally spilling over his dark lashes. I can't carry that immense guilt anymore.
I simply won't do it. You need to go, Mom. I'm staying here. Evelyn stared at him, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly.
The one thing she had prioritized over everything else, her golden investment, was formally declaring bankruptcy on her love. She looked between the two of us, seeing a united front she had never anticipated. Without another word, she turned on her heel and practically ran down the hallway, fleeing the ruins of the family she had single-handedly destroyed.
I watched the heavy glass doors of the courthouse swing shut behind Evelyn, sealing her permanent exit from my life. A profound silence fell over the corridor, leaving only Leo and me standing awkwardly under the buzzing fluorescent lights. The phantom brother and the invisible sister, finally left alone without the suffocating presence of our mother's relentless ambition. Leo slumped heavily against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting completely on the polished floor. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, heaving sobs. It was the absolute collapse of a man who had carried the weight of the world until his spine had entirely shattered. I stood there for a long moment, just watching him. A part of me wanted to walk away. I legally and morally owed him nothing, but as I looked at him, I didn't see the arrogant prodigy who always got the largest stack of pancakes. I saw a deeply traumatized victim of the very same woman who had abandoned me. Clara had taught me how to prune dead weight from a garden, but she had also taught me how to recognize a plant that just needed new soil to survive.
I walked over and sat down on the cold floor, right next to him. I didn't hug him, and I didn't offer empty platitudes. I just sat there, offering my quiet, steady presence. For the first time in over a decade, we were sharing the exact same space, breathing the exact same air, without a musical instrument or a competition wedged between us. "What do I do now?" he whispered brokenly, not lifting his head. "You breathe," I said quietly, staring straight ahead. "And then, you figure out who you are without the instrument." The ride back to the Higgins estate was completely silent. I hadn't explicitly invited Leo, but when I walked toward my truck, he had simply followed me like a lost dog. I unlocked the door and let him into the passenger seat without a single word. When we pulled up to the sprawling, vibrant gardens of my home, he stared out the passenger window in absolute awe. "You really built all of this?"
he asked, his voice full of genuine wonder. "Clara gave me the rich soil. I did the planting," I replied, turning off the ignition. I looked at him, studying his exhausted, pale features. "Listen to me very carefully, Leo. You cannot live in the main house. That space is mine, and I need my complete peace." He nodded quickly, looking deeply ashamed. "I know. I'll find a cheap motel in town. I really needed to get away from her." "There is a small apartment over the detached garage," I continued, completely ignoring his interruption. "It's drafty, it needs a deep clean, and the hot water is incredibly temperamental. You can stay there." His head snapped up, his eyes wide with utter shock. "Maya, I can't ask you to do that." "You didn't ask," I stated firmly. "That there are strict conditions. This isn't a family handout. You are going to work. The nursery needs heavy lifting, dirt moving, and compost turning. It's grueling, filthy manual labor, and you will earn minimum wage. You will pay me rent for the garage. If you complain or if you call Evelyn, I will throw you out myself." Tears welled in his eyes again, but this time a fragile smile broke through. "Manual labor?" he whispered. "I would love nothing more." The transition was anything but elegant. For the first 2 weeks, Leo was completely useless at the nursery. He complained about the blistering heat, his back ached from hauling bags of premium mulch, and he accidentally overwatered an entire row of delicate ferns. I didn't coddle him, and I certainly didn't intervene when he dropped a terracotta pot on his own foot. I simply handed him a broom and told him to clean it up. But slowly, a remarkable transformation began to take root. The pale, ghost-like shell of a prodigy began to tan under the steady summer sun. He stopped wearing his worn-out city clothes and started borrowing oversized flannel shirts from a donation bin in town. One afternoon, I paused by the greenhouse to watch him work. He was repotting a massive, stubborn aloe vera plant. His hands, the famous hands my mother had insured for an absurd amount of money, the hands that were never allowed to touch anything rougher than a velvet cloth, were completely caked in dark, rich potting soil. He had a smudge of dirt across his forehead, and he was humming a quiet, off-key tune to himself. He looked up and caught me staring. Instead of looking ashamed of his filth, he held up his dirt-covered palms with a proud, exhausted grin. "I moved 3 yards of compost today," he announced, breathless and sweating. "You missed a spot by the hydrangeas," I replied dryly, hiding the deep warmth blooming in my chest. He just laughed, a rich, genuine sound I hadn't heard since we were small children.
The soil was doing exactly what Clara had taught me it would do. It was breaking him down, stripping away the artificial expectations, and letting the real, grounded person finally emerge from the dirt. Autumn arrived, painting the estate in brilliant shades of amber, crimson, and gold. The air grew crisp, and the nursery transitioned into its busy harvest season. Leo had been living over the garage for 5 months. We weren't best friends, and we still had awkward, lingering silences, but the toxic resentment had fully evaporated, replaced by a quiet, mutual respect. On a chilly Tuesday, the mail carrier handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope. I immediately recognized the elegant, looping handwriting on the front. It was from Evelyn. I walked into the greenhouse, where Leo was meticulously pruning a row of bonsai trees. I held the envelope out to him in silence. He stopped cutting, his shears hovering in the air. He stared at our mother's handwriting for a long, heavy minute. I could see the old, ingrained panic fighting to resurface in his eyes. "She probably wants to know if I'm coming back to the city," he muttered, his voice tightening. "Or she's demanding a cut of my minimum wage. Do you want to read it?" I asked gently, leaving the absolute choice in his hands. He took a deep breath, stepping back from the table. He looked at his calloused fingers, completely stripped of their former softness, and then looked at me. "No, I really don't." He reached out, took the letter from my hand, and walked deliberately toward the small cast-iron incinerator we used for diseased plant clippings. He tossed the unopened envelope inside and struck a match. We stood shoulder to shoulder in the warm greenhouse, silently watching the heavy, cream-colored paper curl and turn to ash. It was the exact same ritual I had performed on my 18th birthday, but this time I wasn't grieving alone. We were burning the past together. Later that evening, I knocked on the door of the garage apartment. It was the first time I had initiated a visit to his space. Leo opened the door, looking surprised. The small room was modest but impeccably clean, smelling of fresh pine and laundry soap. Sitting on the center of his small dining table was his old violin case. It was open. The instrument rested inside, a beautiful, polished piece of mahogany that had dictated our entire childhoods. "I was just looking at it," Leo said quickly, stepping in front of the table as if trying to shield me from the sight. "I'm not going to play, I swear." "It's okay, Leo," I sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm not allergic to it." He looked down at the floorboards. "I hate this thing, Maya. I hate what it made her do to you. I hate what it made me." "It's just wood and strings, Leo," I said softly, stepping fully into the room. "The instrument didn't abandon me. Our mother did. The violin didn't force you into a panic attack. Her expectations did. You don't have to hate the music just because she weaponized it." He looked at me, tears silently tracking down his cheeks. He slowly reached into the case and picked up the bow. He didn't tighten the strings, and he didn't assume the rigid, perfect posture Evelyn had drilled into him. He simply sat on the edge of his bed, rested the violin on his knee, and plucked a single, resonating string. It wasn't a masterpiece or a symphony. It was just a note.
a quiet, solitary sound of a man slowly learning how to make peace with his own history, and I stood there, simply bearing witness to his healing. The annual Higgins Estate Autumn Festival was the busiest day of the year. The sprawling lawns were filled with local vendors, laughing families, and the sweet, lingering scent of hot apple cider. The estate had never felt more alive. I stood near the entrance, coordinating parking and managing the chaos with a clipboard in hand. Across the yard, I spotted Leo. He was manning the pumpkin painting station for the local children. He was wearing a ridiculous oversized scarecrow hat, laughing openly as a toddler accidentally smeared orange paint across the sleeve of his flannel shirt. Mrs. Gable, the town baker, walked up beside me, handing me a warm cinnamon roll. "Your brother is wonderful with the kids, Maya." "He's a completely different man than the rumors suggested. He just needed a change of scenery," I smiled proudly, taking a bite of the pastry. Watching him navigate the chaotic, joyous crowd, I realized a profound truth. For my entire life, I had longed for a traditional family. I had deeply mourned the mother who couldn't love me and the brother who couldn't see me. But family isn't a static, unchangeable inheritance. It is a garden. It requires constant tending, deep patience, and the willingness to uproot the weeds. Clara had been the gardener of my soul, cultivating my strength when I was nothing but a fragile, abandoned seedling. And now I was the gardener of this estate, offering Leo the same safe soil to rebuild his shattered roots. We were deeply imperfect, scarred by our shared past, but as I watched him hand a perfectly painted pumpkin to a beaming child, I knew we were finally going to be okay. The festival ended, and the last of the trucks pulled out of the driveway, leaving the estate bathed in the quiet silver light of the autumn moon. I walked through the gardens, my boots crunching softly against the fallen leaves, until I reached the small hill overlooking the property. I stood in front of Clara's polished headstone, surrounded by the wild, thriving roses we had planted together.
"We did it, Clara," I whispered into the cool night air. "The house is safe. The deed held up perfectly. You completely outsmarted her." I placed a single, perfectly bloomed white rose against the cold granite. I didn't feel the crushing grief of her passing anymore. I only felt a towering, immense gratitude. She had saved my life in every measurable way. She had given me a home, a purpose, and the legal armor to protect my peace. Down below, the lights in the main house glowed warmly through the Victorian windows, casting a golden, inviting light onto the manicured lawns. A short distance away, a single cozy light flickered on in the apartment above the garage. My mother had tried to convince a judge that this estate was a prison built on coercion and isolation. She had completely failed to understand that it was exactly the opposite. It was a fortress. It was a sanctuary for the discarded, a quiet refuge for those exhausted by conditional love. I turned away from the headstone and began the walk back down the hill toward my warm, sturdy home. I was no longer the invisible daughter shivering in a cold, empty house. I was Maya Higgins. My roots were deep, my walls were strong, and for the first time in my entire life, I was exactly where I belonged.